Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm tackling a topic that's as old as human relationships themselves, and yet rarely spoken about openly. I'm talking about affairs. Now, 1 in 5 people are impacted by them, but beyond the headlines and the judgment that goes with it, there's a deeper story here. Affairs can be about longing, about loss, about the ways we try to fix something that's broken in our lives, even if it means breaking the rules. To help me through this, I'm joined by Juliet Rosenfeld, a psychoanalyst and author of Affairs, Stories of Love, Lies, Hope and Desire. Juliet brings a fascinating perspective on why affairs happen, how they're shaped by the unconscious forces that live in all of us, and why they're so hard to talk about. We'll explore the ethical dilemmas of telling real stories of betrayal, how to write about affairs without harming the people behind them. We'll look at the very idea of a couple, what holds us together and what pulls us apart, and how Juliet's work as a psychoanalyst has given her a unique window into the hidden sides of our relationships. You'll hear how she gathered some really powerful stories, why she believes we need to understand the unconscious to live with ourselves, and how affairs can be both deeply human and deeply destructive. So if you've ever wondered why people risk so much for love, and what these transgressions can teach us about ourselves, then this is the episode for you. It's my discussion with Juliet Rosenfeld on affairs. Welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here because you've written a fabulous book that I can't wait to talk about. But before we talk about the book, we should probably talk a little bit about you. Can you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, well, I'm a psychoanalyst working in private practice in London. And I also am, I suppose, a writer. This is my second book. Yeah.
Psychoanalyst, what does that mean for people unfamiliar with this?
Being a psychoanalyst is someone who is very interested in their patients' unconscious processes. So, psychoanalysis, really the legacy of Freud. And so the ways in which our minds actually, when interpreted, explain all sorts of feelings and emotions to us that tend to not surface necessarily in kind of conscious life. The kind of, I guess the sort of trope would be the psychoanalyst, tell me about your dreams. But actually, we are very interested in dreams because dreams are what happen when we're unconscious, when we're asleep. And I think we all have a very powerfully mobilized unconscious, which often conceals a lot of feelings that we repress, in our day to day. So obviously in a dream, they're much more obvious if someone can remember a dream. But I think the unconscious is something everybody has. If you see a psychoanalyst, you're tapping into it. But anyone can think about their unconscious processes. And psychoanalysis, is very focused on that. But we all have an unconscious. Doesn't cost any money. We have one. And I'm very interested in what our unconscious reveals to us.
And so the sort of people that are coming to you, in essence, you're helping them to unlock something. So this would be people coming with who've been through a particular experience or who have something that they just want to unlock, and you help them to do that.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. I think if I would add one element to that, I would say that I think I'm almost always dealing with patients who have a broken relationship of some kind or another, maybe historical, maybe present, maybe with someone they're very intimate with, maybe sometimes with a boss, maybe with a friendship that has gone wrong, of course maybe with a parent or sibling, relative. But I think that's often what someone like me is trying to think about, is why is someone struggling with their relationships? And of course, the relationship with themselves is at the heart of that.
And that's a beautiful segue into the amazing book that you've just written. Tell us about the genesis of that.
Well, I've obviously been thinking about this a lot. Why did I write it? You think about after the event, because it's not written till it's written.
It's also a heck of a lot of work. So I always think there's an interesting when you've written a book is like, well, why did I go through that? It's an important question.
Why did I do that? I think affairs, which is the subject of my book, are interesting. I think they're fascinating, actually. And I think on so many levels, affairs are a transgressive, uh, here we are talking about risk, they are a jeopardy-filled behavior for most people. I'm not into generalisation, so I'll kind of caveat it that obviously not all affairs are risky, but I would be hard pressed to think of one that didn't involve some kind of jeopardy, because they are about breaking a compact, an agreement with another human being that you have made the closest, most intimate agreement you can make, when you're in a relationship with somebody. So I think that's interesting. And I think that I've always been interested by affairs. I mean, most great books have an affair at the heart of them. Anna Karenina, you know, Madame Bovary, but also most films, most kind of creative, detailed descriptions of love often have an affair. And I think this relates to the fact that, we don't all have two parents raising us. We don't all have our parents raising us, but the relationship that we witness, the first relationship that we witness is normally between, two parents. And I think even if we don't have two parents, there is the idea of a couple, I think, that inhabits all of us. We all have to know where we're from. We all know that, it in some ways, even today with modern medical technology, it takes two people to make a child and a baby. And I think this idea of a couple is very, very sort of internally within, our unconscious from early on. And of course, we're witnessing that couple or that idea of a couple all around us. And this is really what Freud called, Oedipus, the Oedipal complex, many iterations of it since. But I think that the Oedipal complex is fascinating to all of us, even if we don't call it that. We're fascinated by, what is this thing called a couple? Why do people get together? What is it all about? And what's it all about when it gets ripped apart? And that's what I was interested in understanding more about.
And to state the blindingly obvious, you have obviously met lots of patients for whom this has been a feature, and therefore you've seen real life stories. And so you're thinking, I need to write a book about it. But obviously you're not allowed to write about your patients themselves. So you did something really, really interesting. So how did you come up with the idea for getting the stories that you were going to feature in the book?
Actually, it was a friend who suggested it, who said, I was saying, I really want to do this book, but I think there's a real problem. And if I can sort of slightly digress, because I think this is a really interesting aspect of your podcast on risk, is that I think there's a growing number of people that want to know what psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, what they do in their consulting room. What the heck goes on when you come and see someone like me? And there is a literature that, that is developing around that. People like Irvin Yalom were doing it 40 years ago brilliantly with case studies. And of course, Freud set out to explain this new science, this new, way of thinking about the mind by his case studies, which he anonymized by using initials or just a first name. But Freud's case studies were being read by a very tiny group of physicians. There wasn't the internet, there wasn't the way of kind of disseminating information that we have now. And I think that puts this way of writing and wanting to kind of expand the understanding of psychotherapy, people like me who want to write for kind of general audiences. I'm not particularly interested in writing for clinicians. I'm interested in writing for anyone who wants to know about what psychotherapy is. And of course, I'm biased. I want people to know about what I think can be the transformative ways in which psychotherapy can really improve someone's life. I mean, that's in the end of the day what it's all about. Can you live better with yourself? But there is a problem, because the reason that psychotherapy works in the way it does is because I think you are guaranteeing your patient an absolute confidentiality for life. And that confidentiality and that frame that you enable and that you promise through, of course, the ethical guidelines that you abide by, the memberships that you have of the various regulatory bodies, your training, your own analysis, and so on. Really, what a patient feels, I think, is that they grow to feel they trust you, and they grow as the work grows. And I think that is complicated when you're also wanting to write about what goes on, because you're not just writing about theory. And any clinical paper that I go and listen to if someone says this is purely theoretical, I immediately think, well, I'm not going to learn much. We learn because we learn, don't we, through each other's experiences. I mean, that's what I think great literature is about. And what does it feel like to be you? Can you put into words, writer? What does it feel like to be you? That's why I read. And so there's a dilemma. And I think that once you have written about a patient, you are in a situation where even if that patient has agreed for you to write about them, I think something has been there. There's a kind of transgression there. Now, that is for individual writers to work with and to understand. But I did not feel that that was what I wanted to do. And I think that I I realized that if I put an advert in and I was really clear about the kind of contract that I would make with anyone that replied to me, that I would be using my analytic skills, as a clinician. At the same time, I would not be their therapist. And that would give me freedom to write. I was very clear with the respondents to my advert. By the way, yes, I put the advert in various different places, respectable publications, as someone called it, places the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, Spectator. I put it on the Mumsnet website. And I got just, my inbox was full within days, actually, which told me something really interesting. My advert said, psychotherapist and writer interested in affairs is, looking for people willing to help with research. That was what the advert said. And I had a kind of an agreement with these people that I would be listening and I would be interpreting and I would be writing about them. Also, of course, they were not my patients. I did have a duty of care. I do have a duty of care. But I think part of the reason it took me so long to write it was because I'm not a novelist, and I had to really think very hard about how to anonymize, disguise these stories, and also how to really explain and give a formulation for what I thought each person was doing, and also get to know them. That's part of the reason why the book took me 4 years to write, is because I talked to some people on and off for 3.5 years.
I mean, it's fascinating because you're, on the one hand, this is what you do, having these sorts of conversations, but it is in a very, as you say, it's a very, very different context. And so was there a temptation to slip into your normal role? Or was that easy for you to step into I guess my sort of the journalist or the writer's role in this?
Well, I'm obviously not a journalist, and I'm not a writer, and I had the luxury of time, which journalists, people writing in that way, don't have. They have to file quickly, and I didn't have that. I had patient publishers. But I think what was at times, and what I think I did quite successfully at the beginning, was to do quite a lot of initial interviews with people, almost to kind of screen out anyone that I thought was coming to me for reasons which I didn't want, which would have been, revenge, free therapy, all people that I didn't feel were sort of robust enough, and that there was potentially an ethical risk that I couldn't be their therapist, and that in the retelling that there would be risk. And so I just didn't progress those interviews. And I looked, and it took quite a long time. I looked for people that I felt could also tell me the story in an interesting way, right? Because one thing that we probably all know is just because you've had an affair doesn't make you interesting. And I had to have people that I felt were emotionally, psychologically really able to describe what had gone on. And what's really interesting, and maybe it was a self-select, this was not a robust academic exercise, my
Right.
methodology. But it's interesting that it was obviously quite self-selecting, in the sense that everybody who ended up being the people that I wrote about had or had tried psychotherapy. So some, I think there had been some degree of working, as it were, with their own unconscious processes before they, encountered the advert and then me.
And therefore the storytelling that they would give to you would be more helpful to you in terms of what you were trying to do. They'd work through this stuff a bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that must have, I'm just so fascinated by building the trust, because, You talk in the book about the sort of standard steps that one would take, but this is a very different form of relationship. Was that more challenging than normal, or were you just sort of taking the bits from your normal work and deploying it in the situation, or did this require a different approach?
Well, I very much used my training, and I also the first 6 months of writing the book. If you're a psychotherapist or an analyst, you have a supervisor. You're obliged to have your own work supervised. And if you've read the book, the third story is the story really of the downfall of a psychotherapist who decides to give up supervision and has an affair with her patient. And as an analyst and as a therapist in this country, you are obliged to have a certain amount of supervision for every, I think it varies, but let's say every 4 hours of work that you do. And the supervisor, whether you're an 80-year-old psychoanalyst or whether you're someone starting out, in your 30s, you have a supervisor, and this is someone senior, very experienced, who you talk to about your work. And it's a very interesting thing, supervision, because it is really about two minds on the patient, and it is really to enable and to ensure that you are always working within the framework that is agreed when you agree to be someone's therapist. Perhaps the most important of all of those rules is do no harm, like a doctor. Unlike doctors, we do not have any physical contact at all with our patients, and that is absolutely essential. And the minute that any romantic or physical anything has begun with a patient would be, I would say, the moment that supervision has completely failed. And so it was a very different. It wasn't like seeing patients for me because, in a sense, I mean, I kept the interviews often to 50 minutes, which is what we work in with our patients. But I suppose it was very different. It's an interesting question, and I'm now trying to think about how it was different. I suppose these people inhabited my minds in a very different way, and they took up a lot of space in my mind, and in a complicated way, because of course I had to transform them from being the actual people that they are and that their families know and their communities know and their employers know and their colleagues know, because they could not be identifiable. And of course, that's the same with one's patients, but in a different way, I was going to write about these people. So they had to become, real people. So that was complicated. But I felt very attached to them, and I think it's very difficult to work with a patient that you don't got to have respect, I think. And I think it's Irvin Yalom, who is one of the great psychotherapists writing about his patients, and indeed a novelist too. Irvin Yalom said something like, any person, whoever you have before you, however terrible the thing that they're telling you that they've done, however, whatever it provokes in you, they are a human being. And that is, I think, also kind of key to this work, really, and key to writing the book. That these were they were human beings coming with sometimes pretty extraordinary stories in the relationships that they'd embarked on, secret in relationships, but all just human beings. And I was trying to be, to tell their stories, to give an account, but I was also using my clinical skills to try and account for what had happened. So giving this formulation which follows every account, which is, of course, speculative. But, there's speculation, I think, in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy too. Well, one doesn't actually know. We're not dealing with facts. We're dealing with what someone tells us. And we're also having to dig deep into our own, trained and supervised minds to think about what is the story that someone is giving us. And just to go back to the ethical question from the beginning, something that is happening increasingly is that the police and criminal prosecution service are looking for therapists to give them their notes when, there are, particularly in cases of allegations of sexual assault, and often that's historical. And I feel very strongly, and many of my colleagues feel very strongly, that we are not here to give up our notes. Going back to this point about confidentiality, we are here for our patient, for the person that is sitting in front of us. We're not there, collecting legal evidence for anybody. We're there hearing what someone's unconscious motivations, feelings, emotions, or everything that means. And that can mean, horrible things, shameful things, embarrassing things you've never ever said out loud. That's what we're there to listen to. And I feel very, very strongly about that we are not there as evidence collectors. And so just going back to why did I write my book? That, an element of it is that we are not there to write accounts or to write accounts or to write anything that sort of goes outside the consulting room. It stays between you and your patient. And this, it seemed a good way of doing it, putting an advert in, and I think it worked.
Absolutely fascinating. And how did your colleagues react? Were people aware that you were doing this?
Not really. I mean, a lot of psychotherapists, psychoanalysts are always, writing. That is how we learn. We write clinical papers, and we go to conferences and we read journals. That's how we learn. So it's not that unusual to be writing. I suppose not that many psychoanalysts write for a general audience, which is more what I'm interested in. But I talked a bit about it. I talked a lot, to a couple of friends about it as I was doing it. And the person I really talked to about it was my supervisor. And we decided to spend 6 months. I said to him, look, I'm going to write this book. And he kind of said, right. And I told him my idea, and he said, okay. And I took a break from patients for 3 months. I sort of had an extended break from not all my clinical work, but some of it. And that was when I started writing the book. And so I had, quite from the beginning, I had a lot of supervision, in a sense, as I was beginning this process. It was complicated. I mean, it was much more complicated than I thought it would be, but what book isn't?
So you're, I guess, maintaining the sort of risk management, to use a phrase that I would use, around your day-to-day work. You're bringing that in. So technically, I guess your supervisor wouldn't have needed to be involved in this because it's not a thing, but you've decided to bring them in as a means of making sure that you're on the right track and recognizing the risks associated with what you were doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think supervision, as I said, it is essential, and any therapist must abide by that rule of having supervision. And, supervision comes in some ways in different forms, but the woman in my book, Eleanor, who is a therapist, she's a psychologist. So there's sort of minor differences in some ways. She's an American, and they have very different rules about regulation there, as you'll have read. But you need to have supervision, because you need to have a kind of separate mind on the work that you are doing with your patients. Now, psychoanalysts have very, very long analyses themselves, and people often wonder, why would you ever have 5 times a week analysis for X number of years? What would you find to talk about? And the argument, which in this country psychoanalysts have 5 times a week analysis, for in many cases sort of up to even 20 years might be how long you would do that for, which would precede your training, include your training, and might continue a bit after that. And the idea is that you really, having had your own long analysis, you really know yourself very well. And the better you know yourself, the less likely you are to kind of muddle or confuse what someone is bringing with your own stuff. And as it were, the continuation of that with the supervisor supervising your work is that, the risk is always there that your own stuff might, just because you've had a long analysis yourself, doesn't make you immune to bad things happening in your life, or relationships going wrong, or people getting sick, or losing, or a partner losing. There are all sorts of reasons that analysis is a very kind of, I think it is a very transformative experience that all analysts have to go through as well. But it's not, you're not immune to difficulties. And I think a supervisor is that weekly check-in with someone who is really there hearing what is going on with you and your patient. It's a very intense relationship, and the supervisor is there to kind of say, is this really about what's this about? Is this about you or is this about the patient? So it's essential. Of course, psychotherapists and analysts also have peer supervision between themselves, which may be formal, or of course it can be also more informal. Always again anonymized. You would never know who someone's patient is. And that's often a sharing of information, which is very valuable. Peer supervision is very, very valuable and sort of recommended. And most analysts will also be in some kind of peer group. But I think that it's not, it is I think it's a very difficult job. And I think that the risks are high when you're talking about someone's mental health. So supervision it's essential. And really the account of Eleanor in my book is about what happens when someone decides they don't need supervision.
I know this is part of the objective in writing the book, was to sort of lift the lid a little bit on what you do and some of these dynamics. And I sort of found myself reading it thinking, oh, good. They have all these things. And it reminded me that in many aspects of life, we just sort of presume that there are controls in place to stop bad outcomes. And I was pleasantly surprised to hear the level of rigor that's there. I'd sort of assumed that there would be some, but you really go into a lot of detail talking about that. And so I found it fascinating to get a glimpse of the controls that your industry has decided to put in place when, I was pleasantly surprised to see they went far further than I was expecting. And that contrast with the US, I thought was interesting, because that seemed to me to be sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum, not where I would want it to be. And actually what you were talking about was actually, this is really tightly controlled. And so as a sort of average citizen, I just thought, oh, that's quite reassuring. But it went much further. It almost pleasantly, I hesitate to say this, but pleasantly surprised by the heavy degree of regulation. And so I thought you exposed that really nicely. And I presume the part of as you say, the reason for having that particular, well, there are other reasons there as well, but that story then allows you really to focus on that.
Yeah, and thank you. Well, I'm glad that you felt that, and I feel very strongly about it. That psychotherapy, we don't have statutory regulation in this country, and I think which I think is a problem. I feel quite strongly we should have statutory regulation.
Well, my start point had been, I had presumed, sort of in a level of ignorance, that there was, and then I was surprised to read that there wasn't, and then I realised that on a voluntary basis, as it were,
Yeah.
you'd got to a level that I felt sort of was akin to what I would expect statutory regulation to feel like, and therefore that posed the question for me is sort of, well, why not have statutory regulation there?
Well, this podcast is probably not the place for it, but people have very passionately held views. And I was on the board of the UKCP, which is the UK Council of Psychotherapy, for 4 years. And I can tell you that that people have, deeply, deeply held views, pro and against. And actually, having been on the UKCP board, I would say that I'm very glad to hear what you say. I think by and large, psychotherapists are extremely, it's well regulated. Psychotherapists themselves tend to be mature, extremely I think thoughtfully well behaved people who, psychotherapists, it's not an industry, it's a profession, and it's not driven by money. And people tend to work individually, and they do it for love. And they do it for love and for interest, they do it for all sorts of reasons. But I think that money is not the central driver for most of my colleagues, most practitioners. And so we have regulatory bodies, but we're not state regulated. We're not, we don't have statutory regulation. And I think it would be a very difficult job to do, partly because everything I'm talking about, this, how do you apply a stat reg to this process where you have two people engaged in a sense, joining their unconscious processes? I mean, you can see why it's not happened, and you can see why successive governments, push it back as a priority. And fortunately, transgressive behavior, breaking of the ethical guidelines is relatively rare. And but I think, public safety is the most important thing, and I tend to think that the best way to ensure that is, is with stat reg. But that's not, that's not where we're at the moment. And you're indeed right that America is very, very different. That was very fascinating for me to learn about. And I debated whether or not, was it just because I'm really interested in, ethics and regulation, that writing about this, this transgressive psychotherapist, was that too much something that was interesting for me and other therapists? But actually, what you say, I think, is important. More and more people are seeking psychotherapy, and more the public needs to know that they are safe when they're doing that. That slightly brings me to another kind of digression, but important thing, which is that people really want psychotherapy, but most people can't have psychotherapy. And because, we tend not to have NHS jobs. Obviously, there are colleagues working within the NHS, but most psychotherapists are not. And, it is pretty difficult to get low fee or free psychotherapy. And that is a real problem. And I think that, you know, I mean, it's kind of always been thus ever since I started training. It's a sort of lament that there is very, very low fee psychotherapy available, or if there is, it's time limited. And the thing about psychotherapy is, you tend to need quite a lot of time to work through, deep set, quite fossilized, painful feelings and problems, that kind of develop in a lifetime. And I think that another reason for writing and kind of explaining the popularity of psychotherapists writing about what they do is because you may not be able to have psychotherapy, you may not be able to access it, but a book is something that, is accessible. And that's why it's also important. So it's a slight dilemma, I suppose, that I'm bringing about. How do we write about our work, but how do we also preserve what is so valuable and so important that anyone going in psychotherapy needs to know, which is that, my story, my account is my account, and, it's going to always be safely between me and my therapist. So I think there's lots of dilemmas here, which are really interesting.
Yeah, because it's not the thing where you could let the cameras in, where we can sort of see behind the scenes, because obviously that would pose problems.
No, no, not at all. And I was approached actually by a production company just when I was beginning to write this, who were wanting to do, I think, a sort of series, and a kind of documentary series. And I remember saying, I just don't know how you do it. How would you do that? I mean, again, ethically, how would you do that? But part of that is about the enormous opprobrium, and I think, the feelings, the shame, the anger, the strong feelings that affairs provoke in all of us, whether it's a politician. I mean, there's some famous recent examples of politicians who've had affairs which have become public. And, there's a sort of way in which people, I'm thinking about one former health secretary whose affair became public, and, really almost a kind of, way in which it became like a laughing stock, and also, a baddie, and she's a baddie. And then, it became the kind of fodder, really, a lot of it's kind of fodder for people to talk about, because I think one of the things about affairs is that they do provoke these strong feelings, partly, in that case of what an idiot. And, it's during a politically very sensitive time. It was during COVID. So, it was really seen as so hypocritical. And at the same time, I think that we are very fascinated by affairs, and public, personalities that have affairs that get caught out are, enormously sort of written about and read about. And I think that's also interesting, because what does it say about us? What is it about? What is it about an affair that sort of seems to switch on so many feelings in people? And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that, we all have an idea of a couple somewhere in us. And when a couple is attacked, in inverted commas, when a couple is broken up because of a third, well, I think right there you have the Oedipal complex. Because really what Freud was saying was that, the baby is born, if we sort of stick to a kind of traditional model, the baby is born to two people. Back then, it would have always have been a man and a woman. And the baby comes into this world and they're the center of mummy's attention and daddy's attention. And then they start to realize that mummy has daddy and there's this bedroom door and what goes on behind it. And baby's not always allowed in it. And there's the painful recognition that we all go through, which is that mummy's got someone else and it's not me, and daddy's got someone else and it's not me. And even if it's just mummy, that we don't have a daddy. Well, mummy's got mummy, or mummy's got other stuff that she goes off to do, like a job or friendships or a hobby. And so that the Oedipus complex is really about this painful realization that we come from a couple, we're born into a couple, most of us. And at some point we are on our own, because we have to be in order to seek our own relationships, as we go into adolescence. So I think the couple is just this fascinating area in all of our minds, whether we, like with me, it's my job. That's really what I think about, is what is a couple. But it inhabits such a kind of important terrain for all of us. And we all probably, you and I of a certain age, we'll all probably in some way have been touched by or affected by an affair. And, one of the things I've been kind of really struck by is people, when they've read the book, very kindly write and say something, is this has given them an understanding of their parents' relationship. From the 1970s onwards was when divorce sort of massively expanded. I think it went from the 1969 divorce ruling, which, effectively made divorce easier. I think it went from 50,000 couples in 1970 to 150,000 in 1971. And this are generations, people born from the 70s onwards. These are the people whose parents have divorced, in vast numbers. And we now live in a society where we're just not marrying in the same way that we were. We're not marrying as much. We're finding alternative ways to be in couples. And maybe part of that alternative way to be in a couple is not to be in a lifelong monogamous relationship and not to have to suffer the pain of affairs. I mean, when you talk to younger people, it was quite a funny comment actually I think the publishers had sent a book to a book influencer who'd said something like, yeah, what are all these old people doing? And, from my, my own, not very sort of my empirical research of, I have teenage boys, they kind of think, like, what is this all about? Why would you bother to have an affair when, why would you bother to be in that situation? And
the idea being just terminate the current arrangement, or have an arrangement where you can do that. Is that the point?
Well, have an arrangement where this isn't causing you the sort of lifelong pain, I think, that I was writing about. And indeed, the sort of lifelong pain that I see with patients who come in their 40s and 50s who are still devastated by a parent's infidelity or by a really unpleasant divorce, that decades later, the impact is still there. And going back to the earlier point of, how do we learn to love? We learn to love by what we see in infancy and in childhood. That's how we learn. If we're treated with kindness, if we receive a lot of affection. I mean, neuroscience now has a lot of answers for this, because they can literally tell you how the brain is shaped. My book is very research light because I'm a psychoanalyst and I'm not really interested in generalization. I'm not that interested in statistics. I think if the statistics were so helpful around affairs, why is it they remain so hidden? What isn't it? Things like infidelity scales. If you want to, understand, if you're interested, psychologists do plenty of infidelity scales. How likely am I on a scale of 1 to 10 to be unfaithful? Today, next year. I don't think this sort of thing is. I obviously had to read quite a bit for the book, but I think what people want to know, as I said, is like, what did it feel like? And that's why I think we also have this massive genre now of memoir, where people, and often women, but men too, are really writing about, very impactful life experiences. And they're saying, this is what it feels like. And so I think there's a great link there with psychotherapy, because that's what we're in this privileged position to hear as psychotherapists. What does it feel like to be you?
And so coming on to the stories that you cover, and you mentioned that you screened out, for want of a better phrase, the people that you didn't think were suitable. Were the stories that made the book, were they all the people that you kept, or did you have I'm sort of imagining it a little bit like a sort of one of these talent shows where people get whittled down and kept into later rounds. Did you have more than, or did you pick your five and then just go with those?
Oh, I had many more stories that I could have written, and it was really difficult, and also it was sort of, yeah, it was difficult to say no. Some people, there were several people who really, really wanted to be written about, but for ethical reasons, it wasn't possible. And, the 5 accounts are obviously blended. They had to be, it would not have been possible to write otherwise. And yeah, I had lots of material, I suppose, that I couldn't use. But I ended up with the 5 accounts and I suppose a deepening relationship with those people as I heard about, either in the case of Siobhan, a relationship, who's the second story, who is the woman, sort of C-suite executive that has an affair with her CEO, and her career is completely jeopardized. She kind of loses everything, actually, including her mind at a certain point. And I won't, I won't sort of, well, I won't tell the account, 'cause if someone wants to read the book, they'll read it. But what her story is about, is really about the kind of the absolute intertwining between love and grief, love and bereavement, which is really the other area that I'm really interested in, is bereavement. And she had suffered a very severe bereavement, which somehow, in her rather cold marriage, had never been mourned. And I think that what she was doing by embarking on this affair, I mean, there were many reasons for it, but I think that common to her story and all the accounts is she was trying to find a solution. And I think one thing about affairs is that they are often sort of solutions, in inverted commas, to problems that people, for any good number of reasons, are very unwilling to do the heavy lifting on, the kind of painful excavation that is required, especially with grief and mourning. And that is not uncommon, and that is sort of is in the psychoanalytic literature, that after a death that is so painful and so impossible someone feels to move on from, that someone begins an affair. And it was a very fascinating story with a very good ending, for her. She's a very exceptional person. But she was someone that had worked through everything very carefully. By the time I met her, a lot of that process had happened. So she was able to give a very thoughtful account of this affair. The man had suddenly left. The married man had suddenly left. Very, very, surprising her greatly, and throwing her into a kind of despair, which in the end became the mourning for the person that had died. I think there's something that Freud says, which is that mourning can never be avoided. And it's true. You will always find your way to it, or it will always find its way to you. And I think there is a lot of mourning in the book. I think there is mourning and solution finding, and, and chaos, actually.
And the thing I thought was really interesting, and I presume this was deliberate, was you picked a range. You have a different. They've all got different elements of story. So you've picked a range of things. One example I thought was really interesting was what one might term virtual cheating. So people that have never actually met, which are sort of very 21st century type of cheating. But you've covered this range of things, and so it was interesting for me because on the one hand, I thought there's commonality around these things. On some level, these are troubled people, and as you say, looking. On the other hand, every single story had its own unique dynamics, and I guess this points to a sort of challenge where, I think your point around generalisations is an interesting one, because we're all tempted. It's particularly the media narrative now. It's tempted to, the five signs of whatever, or if this has happened to you, X is going to happen. And what you've beautifully done with in telling these stories is pointed out that yes, there's commonality, but there's also complexity in individual stories and individual circumstances.
Yeah, well, that is what I think all psychotherapy and psychoanalysis has. I think it's a great virtue of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, which is that we are all individuals. We are completely individual, and that to generalize, to say that there are five ways to bulletproof your marriage or whatever.
But the thing I find interesting, we intuitively know that must be nonsense, right? Because if it was that simple, then we would all, on some level, be taught it, and these things wouldn't happen. And yet we're attracted to those simple solutions.
Because I think we find it very difficult to talk. We find it difficult to talk about what is difficult, what is painful. And I think that the most blunt piece of, advice to me just seems so obvious, which would be, someone says, I think my partner is having an affair. What should I do? Well, talk to the. But isn't it interesting that we find it so difficult? And I think the reason we find it so difficult is because it's so disappointing to love someone and to have to accept that there are things about them that are very unlovable. I think this relates to the earlier point, and really the subject of my PhD work at UCL, which is the sort of decline of the couple in its monogamous form. And it's so disappointing, I think. I think we do still idealize the couple. I think that there are very good reasons for that. There are economic, social, cultural, any number of good reasons why it is, you have a child, they go off into their teenage years. You don't want them to be unhappy. You don't want them to be mucked around. You don't want them to be flip-flopping from one person to a next. You probably don't want them to be in a polycule or whatever it's called. You want them to be happy. You want them to find someone that will love them and understand them, as much as you have done as their parent. I think these are there are sort of unwritten feelings, but, we do have a belief that a stable couple is the best way to live. Now, of course, in some ways that's true, but being in a stable couple is also reliant on a lot of other sort of psychological maturation that we might not all have done. One of which I think is accepting that alongside love, we also probably have to hate. That we really, really love someone, but when they, for the millionth time, fail to put the dishwasher on or leave their pants on the floor or whatever it is, we hate them. In that moment, we hate them. And I always remember a great colleague of mine saying about her very long marriage that they had agreed that, when something like that happened, they would agree that it was okay to really hate each other for 2 minutes, and then they would move on. And I'm sort of being a bit facetious, but I think we find disappointment in love so difficult, and yet to be in a very, very long-term couple, you really have to be able to love somebody and accept that they may do many things that you really don't like. Now, I'm not talking about things that are really unacceptable, being, verbally abusive, being cruel, any number of things, having contempt for the other person. But I think that, I am talking about kind of more ordinary disappointment, and how does a long marriage, how do you weather that? And I think the other really important thing is how women have changed in the last 40, 50 years. There's a reason why women divorce now. There's a reason why women, do not need to be married in the way that they did, say, my mum's generation, probably my grandmother, because we have the same education as them, and we don't quite. I'm a feminist, and there's a lot of problems, and there's a wage gap, and so on and so on. But I think there is a different way that we are trying to understand how to be in couples, and I think one aspect of psychotherapy that is very valuable is also underrated, underrated, is the value of sharing with somebody, your most profound feelings. And often that is about another partner, and sharing is often halving something. And I see couples as well as individuals, and I think it's always a very brave thing when a couple comes to see someone like me. It's about saying there are things, we thought we loved each other, but actually you know, we're discovering there are, more things separating us than joining us at the moment. And you're using the third, interesting, again, a third person in the form of the therapist to try and fix that.
That was my thoughts when I read about that, because I just thought it's one thing going in the room on your own and revealing things to somebody you can trust in yourself. It's quite another, because particularly if you don't know what's going to come out.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. I think it's really brave. And, couple therapists will often allow like a very long, years for a kind of a piece of work, as we call it, sort of be done, because often these things are very ingrained in couples. If you've ever been in a couple, there are all sorts, aren't there, of unwritten kind of contracts between the couple, and also unwritten beliefs. Oh, you always do that. Oh, you always do that. No, I don't. You think that I always do that. And and I think that the couple that the couple that can sort of tolerate that, and also the couple that can tolerate argument is a is a brave couple to tolerate, to be able to have real disagreement, and then to maybe to agree to disagree, to resolve things. These are all very demanding, aren't they? Particularly when you add in, life and family, or whatever economic pressures. And I think, again, that's a sort of inflection point. One of the things I'm sort of thinking about, are there points, I don't like generalizations, but are there points in a person's life where they're more likely to have an affair? Well, again, if we're going to generalize, we would probably say difficult points in a couple's life will be things like, a baby, joyful, but also very, very difficult. Obviously, kind of economic problems, say losing a job, illness, stress, teenage years, probably with children, menopause, we talk about that much more freely now with work. There are going to be these points where, someone or both are under tremendous pressure. And I think these are the points where, the idea of a new person, who knows me, not as this old person, a new, fresh human being, who can take away all of this painful argument and disagreement, and
Sort
so
of wipe the slate clean, effectively.
wipe the slate clean with a new human being. But actually, that rarely happens, and the old problems, can become greater, or someone realizes that the problems are not really to do with the couple, they get located in the couple. But as I absolutely know from my work, and I think this is clear from the book, the problems that really have a very, very early origin and are to do with our early ways of being treated or relating to people close to us, have a way of kind of resurfacing at very stressful, that feeling of not being loved enough, not being looked at enough, not being the apple of anyone's eye. When those feelings, resurface at a stressful point in adulthood, I think that probably is when someone can become, man or woman, become vulnerable to thinking, well, if I just begin this new relationship, then everything will be fine. But of course, it normally isn't. And another thing I have written about a bit was how interesting it is that no one's ever come to see me at the beginning of an affair.
Yeah, I thought that was really, and it made perfect sense to me, because I presume in most cases people aren't planning in that way.
Yeah, they're not planning, and I think also, the sort of irresistible, when an affair begins sexually, and the relationships I wrote about. Of course, you're right, there are virtual affairs, and there is one in the book, although it's very sexually charged. And that is a whole other subject. What technology enables people to do is really interesting writing and books on it. I can maybe send a, list if you have it, but some very interesting writing about like what happened during the pandemic, how inventive people became. But I think that the real kind of change when an affair becomes an affair is often when sex begins, and that is a sort of a point often when people are not really thinking kind of reflectively or rationally. Freud says something like it's impossible to work with people who are in love. They just don't make any sense, because the loved object is just the central thing in their mind, and they are perfection, and that person has no faults. And when you fall in love, that is what it's like. I mean, that's what happens. This is just this amazing person that you can't see anything, and it's a transitory stage. It is only a stage. It would not be possible to sustain that, nor helpful, but it is a very intoxicating stage. And psychotherapists have written about it as being quite, a bit like a drug, taking drugs. It's just fantastic. Nothing touches you while you're in that kind of heightened state, but there is always a coming down, and there must be that. There must be that from a kind of falling in love. Such an interesting word we use, isn't it? Falling in love, to a loving state where all sorts of other things are going on and have to be kind of brought in. But when you begin an affair, that's not the case, because, an affair is generally about, a kind of laser-like focus on the two participants, two perpetrators, and everything else, including other people's feelings, goes out of the window.
And you've written and talked before about the idea of part of the purpose of writing the book was to destigmatize affairs and to sort of normalize them. And my sense of talking to you, and I was interested in your earlier comments about 2025-ish structures that might, but it's there's almost, given the way you've talked about relationships, the importance of the couple, there's almost an inevitability these things are going to happen. Given the structures that we have and the way humans interact with one another, there is sort of, I get reading it, one could read the stories and sort of go, well, I would never do that. But there's always a sense when one reads it of there are things that we will, even if we haven't been directly involved in one ourselves, but things that we will recognize and sort of go, not quite there, but for the grace of God. But there is an inevitability to this, given the constructs that we have.
Well, maybe that's why public affairs, when politicians or actors do them, maybe that's why we're so fascinated. Maybe there's also a sense of, thank God it wasn't me, Yes, I think they're very common. And I think, the most reliable statistic I could find, because I don't think the statistics are terribly reliable.
Because lots of people aren't disclosing them all.
Right. So it's a YouGov, it's a YouGov statistic, and I think it's 2019. And it was 1 in 5, or well, we got to as 1 in 5, because I think only 85% of people asked responded, and 15 others said they wouldn't reply or they didn't know. And which in a way, I mean, I think it's a fascinating thing that we now really have every aspect of our lives is audited, isn't it? Can be monitored. And yet, isn't it interesting that these relationships do remain very hidden from sight? People do keep them very secret for all sorts of reasons. Which brings me back to Freud and another interesting kind of human characteristic, the capacity for keeping a secret. And, if you've ever, I don't know if you have children, but if you know what, you've seen a little child the first time they know something that mummy or daddy or their big sister or brother doesn't know, it's mine. Or, I've got a best friend and we've got something that no one, it's so human that, and it's a capacity, it's also a really important and healthy capacity to be able to keep us, I ask you to keep something private. I do not want you to tell anybody else. I'm investing that trust in you, and you keep that. It's important. Going back a bit to what I was saying about therapy. At the same time, and Freud also says this, when we lie, we get sick. And an affair and to have an affair requires an enormous emotional investment to protect that secret. And that's largely not good. It's not really good for anybody. And I think that this deceptive aspect of it is critical. This other area I'm really interested in, and I think it's not that well researched, probably because of, the sorts of timings that we've been talking about historically, but is the impact on the children of divorce in the long term. I think there's a way in which we often, because parents invest so much in their children and their happiness, I think parents feel so guilty when they separate and they divorce, perhaps even more so when someone else is involved. And it's very, very difficult for a child. I think children often pick up without being told anything, something is going on. And that impact of kind of trust being blown apart and everything you thought you could guarantee and, being gone it does have really, really enduring consequences on people's own ability to kind of go into relationships and begin trusting someone else, with everything, which kind of what you say you're doing, isn't it? You don't have to be married if you have a kind of a partnership with someone where you're living together and sharing things, sharing children. So I think there are many, many aspects of affairs that we need to understand better, and that I'm the opposite of an apologist for affairs. I do think though that most things, when we try and think about them carefully in a measured and thoughtful way, that kind of yields something, and that was what I was trying to do with the book.
And obviously you've covered it from the perspective of the people who were doing the cheating. Yeah, it would be possible to find people that were hesitate to use the word victims, but who suffered from it. But obviously there'll be lots of people that don't know or have yet to discover. Is that something you'd be interested in looking at, or are you just sort of fascinated? Because I guess you sort of, it makes sense to start where you've started, but are you interested in the other side of it as well?
Yeah, I'm very interested, and I've had quite a few emails from people saying, why don't you do that? Why don't you write that? And I think it would be really, really interesting. I think there's something that I'm interested in. This is more in my sort of doctoral work, which is what does it take to stay together, and therefore what is this escape from monogamy all about? What is going on that means that some people, is it just luck that you just find the right person and, happy ever after? Or actually, are there quite a lot of other complicated factors in place which psychoanalysis might be able to help us think about? I think one of the things about psychoanalysis is I think it has some of the best kind of ideas, ways, suggestions for thinking about life imaginable, really. Perhaps starting with the belief that we all have an unconscious, and if we're more aware of it, then it's a bit easier to live. If I push away those awkward thoughts I've had, um, is that making my life easier? Or if I accept that I have some really unpleasant thoughts, or I had a really horrendous dream that I don't want to talk to anyone, but if I'm able to kind of examine these things in myself, maybe I can live with myself a bit better. So really, I'm very interested in, are there psychoanalytic tools that we could develop that mean that we can understand perhaps and help couples to live together in a more easy way? I mean, another thing about this is that, and including this government, really there is no support for couples available at all. There's not very much mental health support. I think anyone working in mental health will say that there really isn't. What you do is you find low fee help or work, which tends help which tends not to be for very long, or you pay for it. It's largely a private profession. That's wrong, and it's really wrong that couples get no help. We had the Marriage Guidance Council set up after the war, and which eventually turned into Relate, which went into administration at the end of last year. But I think it's going to be sort of managed out. But we don't kind of give couples any help, and then we're disappointed and surprised that so many people separate and divorce. And I think psychoanalysis has a lot to offer. I think it has a lot of formulations and theories that, if put into kind of ordinary language, are really helpful for people thinking about themselves and the person that they love, live with, and occasionally hate. And I would really hope that we might be able to see whether my research is, that's what it's about. Can we find some sort of tools that help people better?
Amazing. As I knew would happen, Juliet, time has just flown. It's been absolutely fascinating. The book, and I'll get you to remind us what it's called, and then do the usual tell people before they can get hold of it as if that were a mystery. But the book was absolutely fantastic, and I wanted to thank you because it helped me, not necessarily on the topic, but actually just to start recognizing sort of human proclivities, and actually that we're all a bit funny and that we all have, and just to sort of be more I was just almost more accepting of my own failings and stupidities and whatever, recognize. And so through those stories, I didn't just learn about relationships. I also discovered something myself. And so it comes recommended, not just for people who are fascinated in why relationships might break down and on why people cheat, but also I think as a broader piece. It's a really elegant vehicle to get into the mindset of people and just to sort of reflect on topics that aren't necessarily even covered in the book. So I want to say thank you for that. But with that said, remind us what the book is called and then do the usual way you can find it.
Okay, so it's called Affairs, and it's stories of love, lies, hope, and desire. And it's published by Bluebird Pan Macmillan. And it's out. I don't know. What else do I say?
That's it. No, it's all good bookstores, I think, is the
Oh,
official.
it's all good bookstores, yeah.
And some terrible bookstores as well, but we won't talk about those. I will put links to all of those things in the show notes. But above all, Juliet, thank you so much for being such a great guest on the show.
Well, it was such an interesting conversation for me too, Christian. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Juliet for appearing. To find out more about Juliet and her book, Affairs, Stories of Love, Lies, Hope and Desire, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. And if you like the show, then please do consider leaving a review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to the show on. It really, really does help. If you want to discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, and there are over 300 of them now, you can do that at the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe and perhaps take a moment to reflect on your own relationships, the ones that sustain you and the secrets they might hold. But above all, thank you so much for listening.